So we're back today on the Magical World of G. Michael Vasey podcast with another scintillating paranormal conversation, this time with Sylvia Shults, who's the author of several books of paranormal nonfiction, including 44 Years in Darkness, Fractured Spirits, Hauntings at the Peoria State Hospital, and Ghosts of the Illinois River. Sylvia and I had time to chat just the other evening. It was a wonderful conversation. We covered a lot of topics, including the historical side of ghosts and ghost hunting and paranormal investigations. She does in fact do paranormal investigations and tells us one or two stories. So I hope that you enjoy the conversation that we had. But just before we go to the conversation, please, would you do me a favor and support this podcast by sharing, liking, and generally pushing it around to people that you know that might be interested. Also, if you'd like to support me in some of the activities that I do, while keeping up with the very latest news of my activities in dowsing, podcasting, vlogging, blogging, etc., why not support me over at Subscribestar? Details below. So let's get back to the interview for this particular episode, and here we have Sylvia telling me how she got involved in the paranormal in the first place.
I did not grow up in a haunted house, anything like that. I don't consider myself particularly sensitive. I don't have that gift of seeing the people that have gone on before us. I have just always adored ghost stories. I have been a voracious reader all my life, and I've always been drawn to stories about the strange and mysterious and the weird. And when I got older, I kind of focused my efforts on not only the paranormal, but ghosts in particular. I've always also been interested in history. So that kind of dovetails so neatly, the idea that history informs the ghost stories. And the reason we have the ghost stories is because of the lived history that people have gone through.
So you've never had a single strange experience?
Well, I never did as a child. I'll put it that way. Since I've started doing investigations and putting myself out there and putting myself in those kind of situations, absolutely, I've had some wonderful experienthis. Nothing too terrifying, which is good.
I have a little catchphrase, because I run a website called myhauntedlife2.com. It used to be really quite busy. It's not so busy anymore because I think Reddit and Facebook and things have taken over. But
sure,
people submit their ghost stories there or their experiences. And so I have a little catchphrase there, because everybody's got a story, right? So
yeah. How
do you collect? We'll come to the paranormal investigative stuff, but how do you collect ghost stories? Because I started by having my own experiences growing up, writing about them, and then I thought, well, I've done all my stuff. What can I do next? So I went and talked to cousins and aunties and uncles and friends, and they all told me their stories. And so I did another book, and that went well. And I thought, okay, well, now I'm really screwed. What am I going to do now? So I started this website and started collecting other people's stories. And then, periodically, either one of the stories submitted would really freak me out and set me off on a mission to find out more, like the Black-Eyed Kids, for example. Or simply periodically, I'd just round up the best 30 or so that had been submitted, kind of do a lot of editing and tweaking and rewriting and string them all together and put out a book. And so like I told you when we talked by email, I'm also a collector of paranormal stories, and I can completely understand your interest in that. But how do you collect the stories?
Well, I read a lot. I read omnivorously and voraciously. And when I come across a story that is unfamiliar to me, since I've read so much, I can pretty well assure myself that it's probably going to be unfamiliar to my readers as well. So when I get an idea for a book, I just start reading all the ghost stories I possibly can and talking to people too, getting their personal experiences. And I put those all into a book. Our methods seem to be fairly similar.
Yeah, that's what I
Um,
thought. That's what I thought when you first
yeah,
made contact and we started
yeah,
exchanging a few emails. It sounded like
yeah.
we both operate the same sort of process.
Yeah. No,
Now,
when I was working on Spirits of Christmas, the book that I wrote several years ago, I read about a Victorian gentleman who Lord Halifax, I believe his name was, and he was an avid collector of ghost stories himself. And with the Victorian penchant for collecting ghost stories and reading them at Christmas, this fellow wrote all these great stories he heard down in a notebook
right.
and kept them. And every Christmas, he would trot them out and just scare the paste out of his kids, who absolutely loved it. Whenever I am reading and I come across a story that makes me go, whoa, or ooh,
Yeah.
I have taken to writing those down in my own personal little notebook, kind of like this Lord Halifax did for
Right.
his own things. And some of these might not make it into my books just because they don't fit any of the themes that I'm writing about, but
Yeah.
they're just really cool, and I want to be able to go back and experience them again. So right now I've started on a second notebook of these just little snippets of stories that I find interesting.
When you collect stories and and particularly when you've experienced a few experiences yourself, you kind of you become sort of immunized to the average story. And
Oh,
so
yes.
I think we have an eye for the extra special scary ones, which is why when I first got my first black-eyed kids experience in, it absolutely terrified me. And I thought, wow, this is the bee's knees when it comes to scary stuff.
I
So
have found that to be true, and I am intensely jealous of you. You have actually had a Black Eyed Kids experience?
no, well, not
Oh,
no, not no. I got a story in on my website,
okay, okay.
and I posted it to the site thinking it was kind of really frightening and
Yeah,
probably a one-off. And at the time, I was working with a book publicist who kind of helped me promote the site and everything as well. And
neat.
over the next 3 or 4 months, we must have gotten about 40 or 50 other Black Eyed Kids stories through the door.
Oh my
And each
goodness.
and every one of them was terrifying. So I did what I normally do. I started doing research. Who are what are the Black Eyed Kids? How long they've been around? And I dispelled a few myths about that many people think it just goes back to this guy in Texas who had an experience and shared it on a bulletin board.
I've
But
heard that story. Yeah.
yeah, but actually, it's not true. I mean, there are stories of black-eyed kids going back millennia. Some of the
Really?
native Indian tribes in the Americas have stories about
Oh,
black-eyed children in the forest that you should avoid at all costs and all this kind of stuff. So I ended
that's
up writing,
awesome.
yeah, I ended up writing a book, sort of more of an investigative. I won't be too. I am a PhD scientist, but I would hesitate to call it scientific. But
Uh-huh.
I did do a bit of research and wrote a good scary book, and it's been my bestseller, Chilling Tales of Black-Eyed Kids.
I will have to search that out because that is fascinating to me. Oh boy, I can't wait to
So,
read that.
so what is the topic? Where I was going with that? What is the topic that you've had the most success with? What scared you the most, and what produced the best sales in terms of a theme or a content or a particular sort of storyline?
Well, I have been very fortunate in my career. I live about 10 minutes away from a haunted, abandoned mental asylum called the Peoria State Hospital. And you say haunted mental asylum, and your mind goes all American Horror Story on you, and you assume that there was pain and fear and abuse. And it is my joy and my privilege to tell people that was not the case at the Peoria State Hospital. So I've been so lucky in that these stories that have come out of this abandoned asylum have been stories of compassion and caring. And the history is just as fascinating as the ghost stories. And
Mm-hmm.
it turns out that this place is haunted to the rafters because the ghosts are so comfortable there. There are some patients that lived their entire lives at the asylum. They came to us as young people and they lived into their 80s. They spent 50 years with us. That was their home.
Yeah.
So they are still there because that was their home. That was where they found acceptance and refuge from the world that could be so noisy and terrifying at times.
And have you written a book about that particular theme?
I have actually written 3 books about the asylum. 2 of them are books about the asylum's spirits and its history.
Yeah.
Those are Fractured Spirits, Hauntings at the Peoria State Hospital. And I collected people's experiences there. And when I typed the end on Fractured Spirits, people didn't stop having experiences. So several years later, I had enough material gathered for a second book, which I called Fractured Souls. And then there's another book in that asylum series about one of the patients at the Peoria State Hospital, a woman named Rhoda Derry, and her book is called 44 Years in Darkness.
Wow. Wow. And again, what has been the story or experience that most scared you?
Well, I have had 2 jump scares in my ghost hunting career. One of them happened at the Peoria State Hospital. There were several of us investigators sitting in the basement of the tuberculosis ward, and 2 of the investigators were dressed as doctors, and one of them had a stethoscope around her neck. And we were sitting kind of in a half circle, and I was sitting next to the girl that had the stethoscope around her neck doing an EVP session in the dark, and suddenly this girl next to me jumps about a foot, and of course I'm like a foot away from her. I jump like a scalded cat because I didn't know what was going on. Something had taken the stethoscope off from around her neck, so
Mhm.
that's what made her leap. The other jump scare that I've had in my career was I was at the Villisca Axe Murder House in Villisca, Iowa, and it was really a special experience because I was there for the first 45 minutes of our investigation. I was there in the house by myself. And you you're walking through this very small house, and you know that in 1912 8 people were viciously murdered there, 6 of them
Mhm.
children. So the vibes in the house can get very intense at times. Sometimes they're nice and calm. And when I was walking through the house in the early evening before it got dark, I just got this sense of peace in the house. This was a house filled with love, where 4 children were being raised by a loving set of parents. It wasn't only until later on that the vibe of the house changed the next morning. And historically, the next morning was when the murders were discovered. So I think the house remembers that. But that night, I was sitting in the children's bedroom. The way the beds are arranged nowadays is that there's a bed near the window, a bed near the closet, and between the window and the door, there is a crib sitting to your right if you're sitting
Mhm.
on the children's bed. So I was sitting there and it was just coming on dark. And I was just sitting there. I wasn't recording or anything. I had no equipment with me at all. I was just sitting there the enjoying the feel of the house and just letting the evening unfold around me. And I knew that there were 2 other investigators in the attic, which is a room just outside this bedroom. So I was sitting there enjoying the evening, and from the thin air to my right, above this crib, I heard a snap, like someone had taken a branch about the thickness of my finger and broken it in half. And it completely took me by surprise, not expecting it at all. So I said, "What the fudge was that?" Only I did not say fudge.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And yeah, it was a complete jump scare. And immediately after it happened, I got excited and I said, "I have to go tell people about this." I stopped at the door of the attic and peered in, and the other investigators were peering out at me and they said, "What was that?" And I said, "I have no idea." It was just something wonderful that happened. So I was on my way down the stairs, and the Villisca Axe murder house is a very, 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 very small house. So you can hear everything. And there's a register, a heat register between the children's bedroom and the parlor directly below it. So I was heading down the stairs intending to share this wonderful experience with everyone. And a friend of mine was at the bottom of the stairs looking up at me. And I said, "You'll never guess what happened. You'll never guess what happened." And she goes, "Yeah, we know." when I when I dropped the F bomb just a few minutes before that, a friend of mine, another friend of mine, was sitting in the parlor, and Troy looked at her and said, "Boy, I've never heard Sylvia cuss like that before." So yeah, that was the other jump scare that I had.
Wow. How often do you go paranormal investigating then?
Well, I usually try to go once every couple of months or so, whenever the opportunity presents itself. I try to get to Gettysburg at least once a year. I love going to Gettysburg. It's always so historically poignant for me, as well as paranormally active.
Yeah,
And
I've had a lot of stories about Gettysburg. I also had a fella on a couple of years back that was living in the area and
oh boy.
experienced quite a lot. Yeah, it was good conversation. So yeah, I can imagine. And is it you that decides, well, I'm going to go do this with that place, or do you get people asking you to come and give them some advice?
Well, I've had both situations. It's usually me deciding to go to a place or being invited to go with a group to investigate a place. But every once in a while, since I've been doing this for over a decade now, people know that I'm not only a writer, but I'm also a paranormal investigator. So if somebody is having troubles, every once in a while they'll reach out to somebody who knows me, and this other person will get a hold of me and say, "Hey, I've got this friend who is having activity in her house and her children are getting scared." So I either go there if the person wants me to, or I reach out by text or phone and I say, "Hey, what's going on? Is there any way I can help?" Because that's the real draw for me. Part of the draw is the history, but with private cases, the draw for me is trying to help, because I accept that not everybody is a paranormal investigator and not everybody is interested in the paranormal. And sometimes people are experiencing paranormal activity and they really, really, really don't want to be.
Right.
And I get that.
So
That
how
is
if someone asks you to
understandable.
come and take a look at something that's going on, how do you approach it?
Well, first I ask them to lead me through what activity is going on, and I try to figure out why this activity is taking place, what triggers are happening. Um, there was a person who reached out to me, oh gosh, about this time last year, I think it was, that she had a tween boy and a 3-year-old daughter, and the both of the children were having frightening things happen to them, but the 3-year-old especially, she was just really having trouble sleeping and being very, very scared about these things that were happening to her that she just didn't understand. And it was it seemed to me that there was a malevolent spirit trying to attach itself to this young girl,
Uh-huh.
because the girl was, I mean, remember, this is just older than a toddler, and she was displaying very violent tendencies. She was hitting her mother in the face. She was oh, she got hold of a mirror and she was staring into the mirror and making faces, and then turning around and hitting her mother over the head with the mirror. Just really strange behavior like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I talked with the mother and found out that the mother did have a pretty strong Christian faith. So I said, this is how you should approach it. You should approach it with the tools and the weapons at your command,
Yeah.
which is put put crosses up, put religious icons up. Um, I suggested salt and holy water,
Mm-hmm.
and she followed my suggestions, and she reported to me just a couple of weeks after that that things had calmed down. She had kept the crosses up on the walls, and everything was tranquil again, and that the young girl didn't have any more problems, and the older boy was calm and relaxed too. So
Okay.
whatever was bothering them seems to have been chased out by that application of symbols that the woman had faith in.
Yeah. You just reminded me of something. When I was in my first year at college doing a bachelor's degree in geology, I
Hmm.
lived on the 19th floor of a 20-floor student accommodation tower block in the UK. They'd have these sort of six students would each have a study bedroom and a shared bathroom and kitchen, right?
Okay.
And my next door neighbour was a chap called Brendan. He was Irish in origin and Catholic, but he was English by
Hmm.
birth. And he knew that I was having some pretty weird experiences
Hmm.
because I'd shared some of them with him. And one of them was that from time to time I would wake up and the walls of the flat would just disappear, and I was looking out on the city of
Oh.
Birmingham, 19 floors up, and this strange priest-like skeletal figure would be trying to get to me and kind of fighting a wind,
Oh.
unable to get to me. And I
Uh-huh.
found these particularly terrifying. And back in those days, these things scared me
Hmm.
unbelievably. Him being Catholic and all, he decided he would take it upon himself to help me out. So he came in and with painted crosses on all of my walls.
Hmm.
Well, this was the end of term and the end of the year, and so 2 days later, I'm moving out of this room, and the guy,
Oh
the
no.
guy comes in and sees all these spray painted red crosses all over the wall, and yeah,
I bet you had some explaining to do at that point.
indeed. I can't say that the paintings were particularly effective, but then I was only there for a couple more days.
Oh.
God bless Brendan. He was only trying to help, but
Oh, sure, yeah.
and in the end, I sort of solved my own problems.
Okay.
In the book side, then, I see you've put together a ghost story for every day. How was that structured?
Oh, that was so much fun. So I was working on a book called Spirits of Christmas. And for that, I was reading incessantly and picking out all the stories that happened in December or had something to do with Christmas. So I became kind of hyper aware of the dates of the stories that I was looking at. And as I was working on that and paying attention to dates, I realized that so many of these stories that I was reading had specific dates attached to them. Either a murder happened on that day, that resulted in a haunting, or it was a recurrent haunting that happened either on a specific day of the year or in a specific season or a specific month. And I thought, my goodness, how fun would it be if I collected all of these stories and put together a book of a ghost story for every single day of the year? And it took me 2 years of research and 14 months of writing, trying desperately to stay ahead of the calendar. But I actually got it done. I found a ghost story for every day of the year, including leap day.
Wow. Yeah, because it says 366. Yeah.
Right, right. Leap day. I found a story for leap day. I found a story for February 29th, which kind of astounded me, but delighted me to no end. And I think I should get bonus points because I did not write about the Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago with the gangsters for February 14th. I did a different story entirely.
Cool.
So
Finding stories and ideas is an interesting process. One of the things that I did, by example, was I discovered a few years ago that some of these travel sites where you leave behind a review of the facility that you stayed at had
uh-huh.
some really fascinating ghost stories attached to them. So, you
Ooh,
go to a hotel's on one of these websites, you'd go to a particular hotel and I'd trawl through all of the reviews.
uh-huh.
And 9 times out of 10, one of the reviews would be something along the lines of, I'm never staying there again. I couldn't sleep. In the middle of the night, the TV came on by itself. The lavatory kept flushing all night long. There's footsteps across the room. So I actually put together a book of all the reviews that I could find and called it Motel Hell. Um,
That is brilliant.
they'll put the lights on for you.
What a great idea. Oh my
Well, they're
goodness.
just, thinking about finding a ghost story for every day. It's like, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
well, that's, is something I did. Yeah, so I think we are a bit similar, sort of,
Yeah.
in terms of the interest and sort of trying to come up with some interesting ideas. Because I think people probably think, well, it must be the easiest thing in the world to put together a book of somebody else's ghost stories, like Gary takes stuff. I go by G. Michael, but my name's really Gary.
Uh-huh.
So, he just pulls ghost stories off his website that other people have submitted, and hey presto, there's a book. But I think you'll
Well,
probably
it's not that
understand it's not
easy.
quite as easy, is it? Because
No, no.
they put these stories in, and I mean, sorry, readers and submitters, but they tend to be appalling grammar, written in multiple tenses. Um,
Yeah,
they
they do
lack
take a bit of editing, yeah.
they lack real objects and subjects and God knows what. So you actually spend quite a bit, if you do it right, you spend quite a bit of time rewriting all of the stories and trying to make them a bit more creepy. As one of
Oh,
the
sure.
one of
Yeah.
the reviewers of one of my books said, it's good to find a book that isn't full of rustling curtains and strange sounds.
Well, good. Yeah. And for my part, and I'm sure you've run into this too, you find a good story that you want to share, but you don't want to be accused of plagiarism. So
Correct.
you can't just lift it whole cloth. You
No.
have to rewrite it in your own words. And that
Yeah.
also gives you gives the story your own voice, which
Yeah.
I find very important. I have had many kind people say, "Oh, you write just the way you talk." And that's on purpose. I want to entertain people with these stories. I want to educate them a bit. I mean, I'm very interested in the history, and I think the history is fascinating, and I enjoy sharing that. But I also want to entertain people with these tales.
Sure.
And I do that by developing a voice. I get a little snarky at times, and I think people enjoy that. But yeah, it's telling these stories in a way that hasn't been told before, and you're using your own voice to do that. So yeah, I get you.
Let's go back to fear because I was talking to a pastor in Baton Rouge just a couple of nights ago. The paranormal
Mhm.
pastor, he calls himself, and we were talking about
Mm.
how he's not necessarily frightened. I'm not necessarily frightened. I'm guessing you're not necessarily frightened. And we were talking about that fear can, in fact, be an emotion which these paranormal events can focus around. Have you found that to be true?
I certainly have. I have discovered this about myself. Um, when I was a kid, I was just deathly afraid of the dark because you don't know what's creeping around in the dark. It can be scary.
Yeah.
So I've mostly outgrown that. I've discovered about myself in going into these places where I know paranormal activity happens. I have found that if there's somebody else with me, I'm absolutely fearless. And I've gotten to a point where I can go off by myself into a place
Hmm.
and be perfectly fine doing the investigation and asking these questions as long as I know there's someone within hollering distance, I guess you'd say. The last time I was in Gettysburg, one of the places we investigated was the orphanage. And the lore behind that is that the second directress of the orphanage was very, very cruel. And she would lock children in the basement in the dark and without any food or comforts of that nature. And that place where the children were locked away is still down there, and investigators can and are encouraged to crawl in to this tiny little crawl space with a dirt floor and sit there and communicate. I took this opportunity to try and communicate. I brought a piece of candy and I explained what this was, and I said, I brought you a treat. I brought you some candy. It's cherry flavored. I just sat there and talked, and I was not scared at all. It was just a matter of trying to communicate compassionately with this little soul who had suffered so much.
Yeah.
And when you think that these people that you're trying to communicate with, sometimes they have suffered. If you're in a place that has a violent haunting attached or a tragic haunting attached, that's what you need to remember, is that these were people that went through this. They're not just scary, spooky ghosts that are out to scare you. These are people that suffered and they want to be heard. So that really takes a lot of the fear away for me personally.
It took me a long time to get rid of the fear, but
Oh, yeah.
I realized one day that it was attracting the attention of things that I didn't want necessarily to attract the attention of.
That's the other thing. Yeah. I know a lot of spirits, especially angry or violent spirits, feed on that emotional energy.
Yeah.
And that's one of the most powerful emotions there is fear. So yeah, they do see that, they are attracted to it, and they do feed on it. You're absolutely correct.
Now, other than ghosts, do you look at any other sort of forms of paranormal activity? So I've done things like bilocation, magic and alchemy, and things like this. Does any of that sort of material interest you? Does alien stuff interest you at all?
I think it's all fascinating. I love reading about strange things like Sasquatch and Bigfoot and chupacabras and aliens and Bermuda Triangle and all that sort of stuff. I've always since childhood been fascinated with anything about that. But what keeps drawing me to write about it and share experiences is the ghost stories. But yeah, the all the rest of it, I just get books on it. I just wallow in it. It's so wonderful. Now, I work at a library, so I have access to just
Ah,
about any book on the planet. And I'm surrounded by books, and they pay me to be there. It's brilliant. We moved to a new building about 8 years ago. We have a new book section, and we got 30,000 new books to add to the collection when we moved to this new building. And I happened to be shelving new books, and I ran across a book that was just on the Dyatlov Pass incident in
yep,
1959. Holy cats, Gary, I had never heard of this before.
right.
And that's my favorite thing in the world, is to come across something supernatural or paranormal that I haven't heard of before. I was so excited to find this, and yeah, I just ate that book up. It was to find a new story just as a grown adult was
Yeah.
just fascinating to me. I loved it.
Well, what I've been doing recently is watching a lot of YouTube channels. There's a lot of
Hmm.
ghost hunters and strange things caught on film and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And my 15-year-old daughter and I last night were watching some, and she said to me, she said, "Dad, would you ever go alone an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere at 4 o'clock in the morning?" I'm like, no, no one in their right mind would do such a thing. And yet there are these people out on the net that do this and film it. And of course,
Oh
then they have some horrific experience. And I'm like, well, yep,
yeah.
you
You
did
went
that to
looking for
yourself,
it.
pal.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I love channels like that, like Slapped Ham and Nuke's Top
Yeah, yeah,
Five.
yeah.
Oh
That's one
man,
of the
I
ones.
just, yeah, love that. And the Paranormal Files,
Yeah.
the blonde kid. Oh man, I love that guy.
Well,
I love
I
Colin.
found some channel by some Russian guy, and there is like an English translation of it.
Uh-huh.
And he's a maniac. I mean, he's in this house that's got poltergeist activity, and
Uh-huh.
he's stood there in front of this wardrobe, and the doors slamming and opening and slamming and opening and slamming and opening and slamming. The drawers at the bottom are opening and shutting, and he's like, "Okay, calm down, talk to me."
Oh, oh, that's
And
so
I'm
compassionate.
thinking to myself, "Calm down and talk to me. If that was happening in front of me, I'd be gone."
I like to think that I would be more on the side of calm down and talk to me, share your story, how can I help? But yeah, I think if I was alone, yeah, I'd
Yeah, he was
nope out of
alone,
there
totally
pretty quick.
alone.
Oh,
I
man.
can't remember the name of the channel because I was trying to figure out, is it real, because
Oh, yeah.
you see all of these sort of compilations of, his is this evidence of a ghost or paranormal activity, and it's some kid's toy that moves a centimeter, and you're thinking,
Yeah.
well, blooming heck, I've had worse than that, and you go to this guy's channel and it's absolute chaos at times.
Yeah, I saw a few shows, and I don't remember the guy's name. Some southern guy, and he was investigating a house in Florida in the States. And this guy would go into abandoned houses, and he'd be in the house for an hour by himself or whatever, or 2 hours by himself. And he'd just get crazy activity. And
Yeah,
I go out on investigations and nothing will happen. I'm like,
yeah.
how do you do this every single time?
Well, that's when you start to suspect that it's not real.
Yeah.
It's not real. There was one where the guy went into a church, an abandoned church, and
Uh-huh.
as he's going through the church, he's commenting on all the pigeon droppings everywhere, and he
No.
keeps hearing some noise. So it's just pigeons,
Yeah.
because of the pigeon droppings. And then he hears what sounds like a little girl's whisper, and he's like panicking, and he flashes his light around the church, and sat in the pews is this little ghostly figure of a girl, and he just drops his flashlight and runs for as hard as he can.
Oh.
Now I've watched that a couple of times, and each time it sends chills up my back, and I'm thinking, you know what? I think this is probably real. I don't think this is staged. How would you get a little girl, aged 4 or 5, to sit in a dark church at 4 o'clock in the morning,
Oh man,
and
I gotta find
cooperate?
that one.
So yeah, I was like, wow, what kind of a person puts themselves in that position? Why would you even do that? I mean, I'm not that kind of a person. I'm definitely interested in the stories, and I've definitely had experiences,
Uh-huh.
and I've definitely studied magic. So I work with meditation and a little bit of ritual and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
I've had all kinds of strange experiences, but I don't think I would seek out solo that kind of an experience. I mean, it would just, I don't know, it wouldn't do me any good, put it that way.
I can understand that. I'm the kind of person that would seek out that sort of thing. I
Well,
like to think that I'd stand my ground, but yeah, like I said, if I'm with somebody, I'm fearless, but by myself, yeah, maybe not so much.
yeah, with somebody else, fine, but alone, you never know what you're going to encounter. And when
Yeah.
you have had a little bit of experience, obviously the first thing is not. My father used to give me advice when I was a teen. He said, "Get angry." Because at
Ah,
least getting angry stops you from being scared, and they can't feed off. They can still feed off the anger, but not as well as they can off the fear. It's the fear
yeah,
that
makes
they're looking
sense.
for. So I used to shout,
Yeah.
f words and things, and but even then, I couldn't really, even with someone else. I remember my parents were away one evening till late, and my girlfriend at the time and I were sitting in the front room watching telly. And
Hmm.
I started to hear the familiar noises on the staircase and stuff that I'd heard often.
Ah.
And she started to hear them too. And so she's looking at me and I'm looking at her and she's saying, "Is there anybody in the house?" I'm saying, "No, no, it's all right. It's just a friendly ghost." What do you mean, a friendly
Oh.
ghost? And she starts getting frightened. And
Oh.
then we're sat there, both looking at each other as the noise gets worse. And then all of a sudden the door opens all by itself.
Ooh.
And she freaked out, and I didn't see her for about another week.
Oh no.
So sometimes, even with someone, it's not that much fun.
Yeah.
It's good to write about these things, and it's also, I don't know, it's sort of fascination with the questions that we all ask ourselves. I think, is there anything? Well, what's the meaning of all of this? Why am I here? Who am I?
Yes.
Is there some? What happens when I die? Why would I be born if I just die and I'm nothing? So I think there's an aspect to paranormal research and having an interest in collecting stories that basically is about more than just ghosts and paranormal. It's about trying to find evidence and convince yourself that life does have meaning beyond just a few years on the planet, right?
You are absolutely right in saying that, Gary, and I could not agree more. And that's something I've discovered in years of doing this. I have become, I mean, you don't want to die, but, and I just don't want to, I don't want to be there when it happens. But like Woody Allen says, but I am absolutely unafraid of death now. I'm afraid of dying, but
Yeah,
not of
I
death,
think,
not
yeah.
of whatever happens afterwards. Um, I was at the Peoria State Hospital, and I have been there so many times that gotten to I've gotten into a relationship with a couple of the spirits there. One of them is a young man named Christopher, who he goes by Chris, and I've had many conversations with him via a psychic medium. And in one of the conversations we had, I said, "Okay, Chris, if you're not supposed to tell me this, it's okay. I understand, but can you tell me what is heaven like?" Because he's not an earthbound spirit. He can go back and forth, and he does. He's told
Mhm.
us that he goes back and forth. And he said the nicest thing to me. He said, "When you get to heaven, I'll be waiting for you. Just look for the tall, gangly kid with the dark brown hair." And to know that I've had loved ones pass away, and I know I'm going to see my grandparents, my grandma, and my dad, and my mother again. But to have someone say that to you, "I'll be waiting for you, I'll be looking out for you," is just one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me. And uh, yeah, there's no fear there. I know there's something waiting for me. And I know there's someone waiting for me. And
Yeah.
that makes all the difference.
So let's talk a little bit about, if people want to find your books, want to find out more about you, where will they go?
Yeah. So I have a website called sylviashults.wordpress.com, and the last name is spelled Shults. So if you go to sylviashults.wordpress.com, you're going to find a wealth of information about the paranormal. There are links to my books. There are links to the YouTube versions of my podcast, Lights Out. And every Monday morning, I post a little snippet that has nothing to do with the paranormal. It's called Today I Learned. In all the reading I do, I come across all these wonderful little snippets of facts that I think are just fascinating. So several years ago, I started posting these little factoids on Facebook and then on my website too. That's what you have to look forward to every Monday morning.
Great.
And then every once in a while, I'll put out a podcast episode, or I'll say something about one of the books that I'm working on. And yeah, that's where you find that all. sylviashults.wordpress.com.
So there you go. My thanks to Sylvia Shults for joining us on this episode. It was a really interesting conversation. And like me, she's a collector of ghost stories. So we had quite a lot in common. And as I said at the front of this, if you would like to help me out a little bit, please do like, share, and push around this particular podcast and encourage people that you think might like it or enjoy it to give it a listen. And in the interim, this is me, G. Michael Vasey, saying goodbye for now. I'll be back with an interview with Jeff Belanger in the next couple of weeks or so. Look out for that one. Thanks. Bye-bye.